Welcome to another episode Out of the Blank podcast. We're knocking the rust off the wheels, my friend, and I'm here with Dean.
Hello, everyone.
See, you like that intro? I try my best to give like enthusiasm because how many people just say a name and then they're like, oh, it's Dean. It's like, stop. You're already ruining the interaction. Restart it. Let's do it all over again and say Dean because it's so much like it just makes you more happy. Like I'll do it to a random person in the store. I'll be like, Jeff, and they're like, who is that guy yelling at? Like, my name's, are you talking to me? I'm like, yeah, you. And he's like, my name's not even Jeff. I'm like, well, what's your name? They're like, Charles. I'm like, Charles. And they're like, who are you? And I'm like, I'm your best friend. And they're like, what? I'm like, we went to that class together, that cooking class in third grade, remember? And they're like, I'm not even from around here. I'm like, oh, well, do you want to be my friend? And they're like, what? I'm like, I don't know. I'm lonely.
Yeah, please be friends, especially just now, right? Because human interaction is quite limited at the moment. So as soon as you get that slight bit of conversation with anyone, you want to kind of latch onto it. That's what I've noticed anyway.
Well, think it through. How many people, like, I would say, are your friends, but they don't really know you? Like, you ever hear someone just go, "Hey, like, I don't know you that well." It's like, well, how are we ever going to know each other if we don't even have a conversation or we don't have any interaction whatsoever? You're never going to meet new people in life. And I'm like, I feel like you should at least meet one new person every single day. I mean, that's not hard to do. It's not like you have to take them out to a nice fancy seafood dinner or something. You could take them to the fucking Olive Garden if you want. I don't really care. But I feel like you need to at least have that common interaction because you learn more from talking to more people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, the more people that you talk to, the more points of view that you see and stuff, you know? So, like, you learn something new every day if you talk to somebody new every day. That's the
Like,
way I feel anyway.
yeah, well, I mean, you could study history books too, much like yourself, talking about history and things of that sort. And when you talk to people, you are getting a form of oral history. You're getting information from somebody's life, their heritage, where they're from. It's a whole different scenario that I'm like, I'm a good reader, but I hate to read. So I'm like, everybody doing a podcast for me is like, I'm hearing history books and stuff. It started, I used to do, I'm not going to say I helped out at a homeless shelter, not homeless shelter, but like an old folks home. I didn't do that on my own accord. I did it because it was mandated by school that you had to do volunteer hours at
Yeah.
like a. So I was talking to all these elderly people, and they were telling me like one of them was a Holocaust survivor, and I was like just learning so much. But like you learn a couple of things from their own life to how many hard candies they'll offer you in a matter of 5 minutes because it's a lot. It's more than you would think. Um,
Yeah.
but it's so interesting because I feel like the hardest thing for a lot of people, or the thing that a lot of people don't pay attention to, is probably the heritage and the stories of the past. And you can get that from like your grandparents, for instance. And it's like you
Yeah.
want to know where that comes from. I mean, I just had this happen. I was at a crematorium and we were trying to make a death certificate for my grandma, and they're like, what's her dad, what's it? And they were going through all this and we're on Google for like an hour and a half just looking, because she was so private. Nobody ever, like, I tried my best to pry information out of her, but like just that whole, like, you want to know where you come from. Ancestry.com is bullshit, but you want to know
Yeah.
where you come from. You want to know what's our family about, what's the crest, what's all these things, because it's history. And I think history is important, much as modern day history is important. I think events that are happening now are crazy and amazing. Like, I love the future, but I also love the past a lot too, because I feel like the past is a good predictor of the future.
Oh yeah, definitely. It definitely is. I mean, well, like what you said, when you like if you go to an old folks home or if you speak to elderly people, you always learn so much from them, I feel. Like, because they always describe a different way of life almost. Like, because I mean, even my parents, when they talk about the way that they grew up, like my dad, for example, he lived in a poor area and he was poverty ridden, and he was always talking about how his brothers and his sisters would always like fight over my grand's jacket to keep them warm and stuff like at night because they didn't have a duvet cover or anything. So it's good when like you hear stories like that, you're just like, oh wow, I never knew that. And then like you always think, well, we do take a lot for granted in some ways in that sense, you know.
It's because we're too
And
comfortable
if
as people. We're way too
yeah,
comfortable. The fact that, like, what you just said about all these kids fighting over a jacket just to try and stay warm. Like, the weirdest
mm,
thing is, like, we've shifted. We've gone from trying to eliminate struggle to creating struggle. And what I mean by that is,
yeah,
like, people literally fast on purpose. They starve themselves as a diet trend when back in the day they were killing each other for like a smallest little piece of a crumb. And I'm like, what is happening in the world today? Like, that just shows that we're too comfortable. I feel like as much as like life is really kind of easy in the grand scheme of things, it also has created a whole other immense of problems. Like I
yeah,
always say, like with technology, for instance, as much as it's eliminated a lot of issues, it's created issues. And then people go, well,
mm,
then this happened and it fixed that. I'm like, yeah, but technology created that in the first place. It's like you created something and it has its side effects. And now you're just learning how to deal with the side effects.
yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, like I don't want to like make my students sound bad or anything, but it's like technology's taken over so much now that like people have become so much more lazier and they don't really want to like try and do things themselves. And what I mean by that is so I'll take my students for example. I shouldn't, but I'm going to. So like I'm teaching them history in English, but they're all Chinese. So they're Chinese is their native language. And then rather than trying to like ask me how to do something in English, they'll just translate it. Like they'll just use a translator. And I'm like, but you're not learning English and your parents are paying this tuition for you to learn English as well as history. And
I'm glad you
it's
feel
really
that way
frustrating.
because that's
Yeah.
why I hate the Neuralink because it's going to make it so easy to understand languages with having a translator in your head. And I'm like, the people that have spent like, there's a dude that's like 70 out there. He spent like years and years and years learning multiple different languages and stuff, spending all that hard work and all those countless hours. And then there's a Neuralink. He's like, oh, well, I learned it in 5 minutes. And he's like, but I spent 35 years learning all these languages. And it's like, oh,
Yeah.
sorry, that technology is finally caught up to where I don't have to spend all those countless hours reading books and trying to figure out languages and going out and talking to people and learning it yourself. And that's what I like about language in general. I like understanding words. Like I like trying to find the
Mm,
correlation first of all, like bigger words that people don't really use anymore. I know there's a whole censorship thing that goes behind it and all that, and I get it. But I like knowing why you shouldn't be saying those. I think you should teach the right and the wrongs, but understanding
mm,
speech. And it's so interesting depending on wherever you learn your language or wherever you learn English, for instance, if you're not from this country, you develop that accent wherever you learned it from. Like I've heard people that are
yeah.
speaking English for the first time. I used to work with a bunch of Romanian Bulgarians. They would
Mm,
most of the people at my work were from New York. So that eventually these kids developed like a New York accent when they talked. And I'm like, what are you like, I didn't even know I had an accent until someone pointed out to me, like, "What's that accent that you have?" I'm like, "What?" And it's just certain
mm,
key words I say are Baltimore words. Like, if
yeah.
you're from Baltimore, there's this, like, we say Tuesday and we say Monday, and I thought that was just common expression, but, like, there's a lot of stuff
Mm,
people were pointing out to me. I'm like, you start to realize, like, everybody's got their own interpretation of a language, and depending on where it's from, you can tell, like, an accent, like, different places in Scotland or Ireland, there's different categories and sections where it's like, "Oh, you're from that area. Oh, you're from this area." I'm like,
yeah.
"This is fascinating how, like,
Mm,
there's these invisible lines that develop us from
mm,
different states, but just because 'cause they're invisible, there's a whole other world in that other state. There's a whole other it's like we're all in
yeah.
domes. We're all in these little separate communities and organizations. If you go outside your thing, if I talk to someone from New Jersey, they're right beside me, but I can't
Yeah.
understand a damn word they say sometimes, where it's like I had a woman at a gas station go, "Excuse me, can you help me over here?" I'm like, What's the issue? Like pumping gas." And she was like, I'm from Jersey. We don't know how to pump our own gas." And I'm like,
What?
what do you mean you don't know how to pump your own gas? You're like in your 40s, and what does being from Jersey have to do with you not knowing how to pump gas? And she goes, "Oh, in
Yeah.
Jersey it's illegal to pump your own gas." And I'm like,
Really?
what? And then like there's two states in the all 50 states of the US where you can't pump your own gas, and that's Oregon and New Jersey. And I don't know the whole reason why. I guess it's because they still have attendance, but it's like a whole money thing. But it's just so fascinating to me how like that's right beside me, but it's a whole different world. I felt like I was stepping back into like the 1900s. I was like, hang on a second, you don't know how to pump your own gas? Like, do you know how to shop on Amazon? Oh yeah, shop on Amazon all the time, but I don't know how to
Yeah.
pump my own gas. I'm like, that's a necessity.
Yeah, that's strange. Is it a safety thing? Like, I would need to look into that. That's weird.
I, I
But,
but there's two states that do that out of the 50, and it just makes me look at like history,
mm,
for instance. Like if you really want to go somewhere, maybe back in time, like I'm a big fascination of like going back through time a little bit. I would love to live in like the 50s or something, not deal with all like the
mm,
low lack of medicine, I would say, but like being able to get a milkshake at a diner is kind of my dream thing. But
yeah.
if you go to some states, man, they are living in the past. Like I love the Amish community because they refuse the technology. They refuse it all. They just want to churn butter all day. I'm like, good on you guys. Good on you guys.
Yeah. Mm. But what's good about that is like people learn different skills that way, you know? Like people actually learn, I suppose it would be like different almost survival skills, or like they have use cars, but if they did, but like they would be able to pump their own gas in the car. So it wouldn't be like you have somebody do it for you. It's quite strange though, because in China they do the same. Like nobody, so like if you go to what we call it petrol, so if you go to a petrol station, they like you don't put the petrol in your car. Somebody does it for you. But the reason behind that different is just like so the Chinese government can say they've got full employment. That's what that's for. So like everyone's got a job in something.
Is it difficult being over there compared to like I don't know how long you've been over there compared to how long maybe you were in like back over here or something like that? Maybe not the States, but wherever. Um,
Mm.
is it different like with like the whole censorship down there? My biggest issue I look at is like the overpopulation problem. Like people like some I read a book by some guy who wrote that overpopulation's a myth. He said that America could hold way more than it holds now. And I'm like, I don't think that's true. I mean, I get the idea that you want to let anybody that can possibly come over here come into the country, but like, man, people like it's hard to live with your family for more than a week. Like when people are on lockdown, the domestic violence went up, everything went up. And I was like, yeah, because there's a reason why you get those breaks from people. You have your me time, you have your personal space. But if you're on top of each other, like I don't get claustrophobic, but bro, when I was watching WandaVision and that guy was going under the tunnels underground or whatever, I was like, bruh, that sewage little thing where you can't, you're shoulder to shoulder with the walls. I was like, I can't do that, man. I would
Yeah.
freak out. I would just panic attack.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, because like when I came to Beijing, I was expecting it to be a whole lot worse than what it actually was. Um, what surprised me was the fact that like the actual size of the city. So like it's spread out quite well. So even though it's got a population of like 25 million in it, like but it doesn't feel that way when you're walking on the streets because you've actually got a bit of space. It's I think the footage that you normally see would be like in Hong Kong or something because that is overpopulated. That's just it's crazy. Like if you look at it, it's just yeah, I couldn't live in Hong Kong. But I mean like Beijing's it's not that bad in that sense. Like there's only been a few times where I've had to like basically kick my way onto a subway to get on it. But generally speaking, there's a fair bit of space.
It just, I don't, I guess it's a
Mm.
claustrophobic thing for me, but being around
Mm.
so many people, it's just like even when walking through New York, I feel like I want to start tossing out elbows, like just start clocking
Yeah,
people because it's so weird to have that many people shoved into one spot. Like I guess I'm more of a
yeah.
rural type of person where I want to be out like in the farm, kind of like country, at least in the open, so I don't have anybody around me. But I think it's like you also you learn a whole different experience when you're from somewhere with a heavy population or something like that. Like you learn more of
Mm.
a not sometimes a community aspect of things, but it depends on how populated it is. Sometimes there's way too many people where it's like my theory of like talking to one new person a day. You don't want to because there's way too many people out there. Like there's just 50,000 people in front of you. Like, it gets difficult, man. Cause I feel like I don't, it's only getting a little bit worse, I would say. It's like the overpopulation and the population is only increasing at faster rate than it's declining. So I'm like, man, back in the day, like a lot of the issues, there weren't a whole lot of super big issues to worry about when it came with people. It was more about worrying, just trying to survive and, get warmth
Mhm.
or something like that. But nowadays it's like, oh, what did this person tweet about me? I'm like, if we're going to monitor tweets, if we're going to monitor comments on social media, you're going to spend all your whole fucking life doing that. Cause there's like 9 billion people that are on Twitter. When a baby comes out of the womb, he's got a legit cell phone in his hand tweeting. Like I don't see
Yeah,
that out of the realm of possibility.
yeah. Like, there's no way that you can censor it. I mean, in China, like they do, I suppose you could say they censor it a little bit, but I mean, every single school that I've worked in, they either have a VPN built into their Wi-Fi, which the government knows about, or they just tell you how to get a VPN. So like the VPN is what bypasses the block, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think the difference is like so in the urban centers like in Shanghai and Beijing and stuff, there's more foreign communities there. So they have to adapt to foreigners coming in and working and like, participating in society. But I think it's more aimed at like the rural areas because like like people, if you live in the village, like the likelihood of you leaving isn't that high. The only person that would like maybe leave is like someone who wants to get a job in the city. But yeah, generally speaking, I think that's where it's aimed at because then like the majority of the population can still be almost like rural. So they don't know anything that goes on outside, and they don't feel like they need to. That's the thing. They really don't. There isn't like this need to know outside information here. It's weird. Like so, some people like they say, "Oh, I don't have a VPN," and they're fine with it. They don't really care about what's going on outside.
It's kind of like sometimes in the States, like at least for me, I don't really care what goes on outside of my like town. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm,
because I think it's
yeah,
because I look at it from a draining aspect. Like you're literally getting so infatuated with other people's news or other people's states information that's nothing. Like I don't even, what was it, like a week or two ago that Texas was like March 15th or whatever, we're going to have no masks. So many people I knew were like, oh my God, it's insane. I'm like, why you don't even live there, we're not even close to Texas, why do you give a shit? And it's like this
yeah,
whole aspect of everybody's got their nose, even in the next state over to them or the next state over this, or California's doing
mm,
this. And I'm like, California's all the way across the country. Like, why do you can't even pay your fucking rent and you're worried about some dude not wearing a mask in Texas? It mind boggles me because I'm like,
yeah,
focus on you when you spend so much time, and this is a problem with kind of the technology in general too, is when you spend so much time understanding or getting information about another issue, a place's issues, you stop.
yeah,
I guess you lose track of your own life. You lose track of what's going on in your community, things that you control. And it obviously just causes stress. It's future worrying. You're trying to stop issues or you're harboring all this anger or all these thoughts about issues that you have no control in. And I'm like, you need to work. That's why they say community, work in your community, because if you act locally, it goes globally, because you're
yeah,
working in things that you can fix. That's why I would love to be like in a small population town. I would love to be like in maybe a town of 1,000, but then I wouldn't mind building up the town and making it something like if it was starting from scratch. But then eventually people will be like, are you coming to the town meeting? You're leading it because you helped us build everything. I'm like, I don't want to be around any of you fucking people. Like, no offense, but like, I'm happy to get you on your feet, but I don't want to have like the cup of tea or any of that type of stuff. I like to be left alone. I like to, because after a
Mm,
while, man, I mean, especially nowadays, it just becomes a little bit more stressful, which is why I think people don't talk to each other anymore. It's like, how many times do you get into
mm,
an actual conversation like me and you are having right now without like an argument or somebody going into a debate or somebody talking about something that has to be better than you? And I'm like, ah, man, like,
mm.
or talking about politics, for instance. Fuck, like that always is like
Oh,
that's always the base level where people just throw out like, "Oh, how's the weather, Jim?" And it's like, "Oh, it's good. It's sunny out. I mean, it's a nice day. What do you think about Joe Biden?" And it's like, "What the fuck was that? You just jumped from weather to Biden." And it's like, "Well, I don't know
yeah.
how else to talk to people anymore, so I just bring up politics to see if you get pissed off if you're on my side or not." And I'm like, "Yeah, all right.
Mm.
They just raised the price of cornflakes. Anybody want to talk about that shit?"
Yeah. But that's Yeah, I agree with that. It happens all the time now where um like even when I speak to my friends back home, that's like the first thing that comes up of like they're talking about politics. So in Scotland right now, there's a big thing about Scottish independence away from the United Kingdom and stuff. And it gets brought up like
Brexit.
every single time. Oh no, this is like so you have the Brexit thing as well, but before that, Scotland had a referendum to leave the UK.
This is why I'm glad I only
Uh,
focus on shit that's happening in my town, because I would
yeah.
go mind-boggling nuts. Like if you just imagine if you sit a person down in front of a TV and you show them the world news and you make them watch that every day for a year. You know how like messed up they would be as a person, just like, oh my
Oh yeah.
God, like while you're sitting there pouring a bowl of cereal, there's probably a bomb going off and killing a bunch of kids in a house. And I'm like,
Mm,
Jesus, man. I'm looking for the toy at the end of the box, not your internal damnation, you sick son of a bitch. Like it's like it, but
yeah.
it's
Mm,
this thing where I'm like, I like learning about history because I feel like a lot of what's happening today, especially with my passion, which I'm going to ask yours too as well. Ancient Greece history, Greek mythology, all this, that's my go-to. That's my love for everything because a lot of the stuff that we pull
mm,
from, Greeks and Romans and all this stuff we're using kind of today. But it's weird to see the shift because back in the day, at least in the ancient Greece times, there were philosophers. There were people that were on the cusp of intelligence or cusp of innovations that were going to change how
mm.
people would act in society or act in their community. Now, every person on fucking Twitter or Instagram is a philosopher, but
Yeah.
they're not really a philosopher. It's just common
Mm,
sense. Like I say a bunch of stuff that's just people are like, that's amazing. That's motivational. I'm like, it's common fucking sense. That's all it is. It's
yeah.
just thinking critically about a situation and trying to find an answer to it. It's not being a philosopher. I'm not
Mm,
writing down poetry like Socrates and posting it on churches or some shit. No, I'm
mm.
speaking. And people now go by pseudonyms and go by all these things. Well, back in the day, like now they're thinking Plato was a pseudonym. So I'm like, it makes
Yeah.
sense because we have this passion. Some people want to say things, but want to have no reparations on themselves. And I'm like, that's my issue. Is like, first of all, you're not going to get the credit if it does succeed. And then second of
Mm.
all, it gives you no liability for your actions. If you feel so strongly about something that you're going to say something, you should make sure that your name is attached to it.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose that's the problem with social media as well now, though. Like, especially like on Twitter and stuff, because I mean, I suppose I use my like, I suppose like, podcast name, so like the Chronicler, for example. But I mean, like people could use
It
any fake
sounds
name
like a
on like
psycho killer.
Twitter or something. I know. So anybody could use any kind of like name and then just like say whatever they want, and then there's no accountability for what they've said. And then like it could do a lot of damage down the line to someone,
Yeah.
because somebody could take that really personally. What's happened, like what this person's saying online, and then before you know it, worse things could happen.
Why the chronicler?
Well, this like so the whole podcast thing started off actually as a way to kind of build up a bit of an audience, build a bit of a community, and then launch onto a YouTube channel. Like that was the idea. So me and a friend of mine who does graphic design, he came up with the name The Chronicler, and he's the one who's like, he's done like a couple of videos so far, which are like animated. But he's still at university, so like because he's back at university, he's not had time to do any more just now. So we're still like kind of plodding along, working on it. So I thought, well, rather than doing nothing, I'll start podcasting in the meantime. Because like whenever I talk about, especially like Chinese history to my parents or even to my wife who's Chinese, she like they're just like, oh, I don't care now. Like they're getting bored of me saying it. So I thought, well, I might as well put a mic down and come up with it. But I mean, the chronicler, I suppose the reason why was because I like I was going to do all the events in chronological history. So it'd be like the start of Chinese society all the way through, probably till the end of the imperial period, because I don't want to get mixed up in like current affairs in China. Like I just want to avoid that, like the rise of Mao.
Hey,
I
you
just
don't
don't
want
want
to
to get
get
into that.
shot or anything like that.
Exactly, yeah. So I just thought I'll put it up to the end of the imperial period and then I'll leave it there. And then once I've done that, I'll maybe move on to Scottish history or something because that's close to home.
Like I get scared talking about some things in America that's going on today. Like if I feel like I'm on the cusp of
Mm.
something, like a conspiracy theory or something that might be true, like some MK Ultra shit, I feel like somebody's gonna come to my house and be like, did you search this on Google? I'm like, yes, I did. And then they just throw me in a freaking van and drive off. And I'm like, that's like, because I think it's important, like it's really hard because with the amount of information we do have out there, there's also a large amount of information that is misinformation. So like a lot of people aren't truly
Yeah,
understanding, or now people are getting all up in a tizzy, I would say, about Google, for instance. People are trying to ban that because it's not it's blending certain results. They're not showing you all the results for things that you're looking up, which creates, gatekeeping of information and stuff like that. And I'm like, man, we're all really just trying to figure it out, like everything. And I'm like, to say that this is not true or this is true is wrong to me. I'm like, there's so much throughout history you could look at with today's times where it's like you got to make sure you're open-minded about everything like that.
yeah,
If it looks like a duck, I bet you it's probably using a cloaking device and it's not a duck. Like that's the motto now. Like it's just like this whole
yeah,
concept of like what's true, what's fake, what do I believe in, and people are trying to find something to believe in. And I'm like, what we should look at are events that have actually happened in the past. But that's even
mm,
gets hard because looking at information from that, for instance, it's wherever you're reading it, whatever source it's coming from, it's probably going to be a little bit biased onto some points. Like
yeah,
I talk about, like, there was probably in the age of scholars when they were writing shit down on textbooks and pen and papyrus. Let's use papyrus. That's a good word. Um, Word of
okay,
the day, papyrus. Uh,
right,
like
okay,
they're writing down all this information about certain events. I bet you there was that 1% of the people writing it down that was an asshole. And he was like, man,
mm,
I don't like how this story goes. So I'm just going to do this. And he cuts out part of the story. That
yeah,
1% has now turned into like 90% of the population today. Like it's a
mm,
bunch of people trying to fix it so the way they want it to be told rather than telling the truth of it. And I'm like, look, if you don't like how the story is, that's a good thing then.
mm,
You should teach why you feel that way instead of trying to hide it and make people find it out later. Like everybody started freaking out when they were tearing down statues because they found out George Washington's teeth weren't made of cherry wood. They were made of human slave teeth. And everyone's like, oh my
oh,
God, we've been worshiping criminals. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, maybe they shouldn't have said it was made of cherry wood. Maybe it should have just been honest. Be like, well, that wouldn't look good on our founding fathers. I'm like, I don't give a fuck. I want to know the truth. Don't tell me
yeah,
cherry wood. I'm a little kid thinking, oh, cherry wood. Then I get in a freaking conversation with an anthropologist, and she's like, oh no, it wasn't cherry wood. It was slave teeth. I'm like, what? Like that's telling a kid Santa Claus isn't real. Like that's a shattering dream scenario.
yeah. Wow, I never knew that either. That's crazy. But I mean,
Shit, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to drop that bombshell on you. If it
no,
was
it's fine. It's fine. But yeah, I never knew that. But I mean, like, this is the thing with like the slavery stuff and that. Like, people need to learn it happened. It has happened. And the thing is, to a certain extent, it still happens now. But I mean, we should learn from it and try and make it better. Like, tearing down statues isn't going to do anything. Like, that's the way I see it, because it's happening in the UK as well. So, for example, there's lots of streets in the city of Glasgow that are named after slave owners. But the thing is, built on that slavery, they brought a lot of stuff into Glasgow. They brought a lot of wealth into it. Like this is the sad truth. Um, so like people should like because like they want to change the street names and stuff. Like I would say don't change the street name. It's been that way for ages, but leave a note to say yeah this is what this guy did. Because like nobody like I think this is what's happened. Like it's all kind of been like shrouded over and nobody knows like the full truth about it anymore. But like if you like give people the right information and like then they can make the judgment themselves.
Yeah. It's kind of like
Mm.
instead of trying to tear down the statues, maybe put them in a museum and teach why we don't have these up anymore. You know what I mean? Because it's still a part of
Yeah,
history. and you're not
Mm,
getting rid of the issue. You need to explain why it's bad. Like, I feel like
mm,
it's a great educational tool to use rather than trying to
yeah.
just get rid of it and act like it never happened. It's like, no, we should teach why that was a thing. We should teach why
Mm,
why we don't think that way anymore. It's all about the evolution of man, right? But it seems like we're shooting
yeah.
ourselves in the foot half the time. I mean, I think people might have different views on this, but I feel like it was way easier back in the day because we were fighting something. We were always at war. So like now this is
Mm,
like the one time we really haven't been in a war scenario. Like we're doing maybe stuff on the sidelines that doesn't get talked about, but not like like Afghanistan, Iraq. Those were wars.
yeah.
Those were things. World War
Yeah.
One, World War Two. They were where people were uniting to come against the enemy. So we don't really
Mm,
have that now. So now we're looking for something. And I feel like you just look for anybody that doesn't agree with you or anything that you can tear down that you don't agree with. And I'm like, how about instead of tearing down a statue, you build up statues around it? Like if you have George Washington statue, then put some slave statues up around him to show how a different side of him, the true side of him, the things that he did, like
yeah.
let people know this is horrible. This is the real thing. You're looking at this guy who's, chest up and looking up at the sky like he's
Mm,
looking for the next great island or something like that. And it's like, well, put up the statues of all the people that helped him get there. It
yeah.
it goes into this whole line of cancel culture I don't really want to dive down, but man, it's
Mm,
crazy because like this isn't if history was more honest, I feel like if it told you the truth rather than trying, because I think people look at the textbooks and they go, oh my God, we were horrible. Look what we did to all these people. I'm like, you got to understand when they were writing this textbook and they were recording this history at the time, they were doing this to show you that they're a force not to be fucked with. That was the
yeah.
whole point of like our government. It was this idea like we had a project A119 which was supposed to launch nuclear missiles at the moon before we even landed on it, before any of that stuff during the Cold War. And it was an idea to show our enemies that we had nuclear weapons and we're not to be fucked with. That's the same thing
Mm,
with the textbook when you're reading it. It's like, oh my God, this dude, they just annihilated this whole entire tribe. And it's like, that was their thinking, was that they were trying to show you that they're this powerful force. Look how strong we are. But now we're in this sense of caring and compassion. We've changed. So, not saying maybe the
yeah.
history books need to evolve with us, but you should understand that's a good reason why you feel the way you do about this history, why you feel so strong against it because you've evolved. We've become more compassionate as people. And in the same way, we became more isolated.
Yeah. I would say so. Because I mean, like, if you look at European history as well, the Europeans, like basically all the way up until World War II, they were fighting in some war. Like if it wasn't the British and the French, it was the Prussians and the French, and it was always like this continuous form of warfare. And then after World War II, like the European countries got together, and then like you had the steel and the coal sharing, which has then evolved into the EU. And it's almost like because like what you said, there hasn't been this big war in years, and it's almost like people are struggling to deal with peace. That's what it feels like. So like, because normally people get like the population gets steered in a certain direction, but like to fight this enemy. But right now there isn't really this big enemy to fight, so nobody really knows what to do anymore. That's the kind of feeling that I'm getting from it. It's yeah, it's a strange time to be alive, for that sense anyway.
I think like the idea of world peace was something that we always want, but I feel like you only feel that way when you're at war. But then when you
Mm,
actually have a sense of peace or you have a sense of like there's no giant conflict going on, you just spark up that
mm,
conflict wherever you possibly can with the people that are around you. Like eventually after a
mm,
while there became a fight between non-maskers and maskers. And I'm like, man, this is just people trying to find a way to because I think it's a natural thing in all of us to want to debate and to want to have like our own strong opinions and fight for what we believe in. But a lot
yeah,
of that gets skewed, like I said, with misinformation and stuff like that, where it gets turned into more of a warfare. So, like, I don't ever think there's going to be world peace. And I don't know if we would be able to handle it. I feel like the best we can do is try and be at least, if not compassionate towards each other, is to be maybe a little bit more of like just like passive with each other. We don't need to
Mm.
have this sense of kumbaya all sitting in a circle, but at the same time, we should learn that, everything nowadays turns into, if I'm going to help this person, I got to make sure I get something out of it. Like, it's got to be like, well, how is this
Yeah.
going to help me? And I'm like, well, you're thinking wrong. You know what I mean? You're already
Mm.
trying to get something out of something you shouldn't be getting something out of. But that's just how we cope with an idea of helping somebody, is like, oh, I got to make sure it's in my cards, or it's taking off something on my checklist. And I'm like, man, if you help somebody with something, usually that karmic favor kind of returns back to you in some way. They might help you out later down the road when you need
Mm.
it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, especially like because like I've seen that a lot recently. So it's like, what can I get from this? It's always like with like society has turned into that kind of like selfish way. And it's like what you were talking about earlier, like just working in the community. A lot of people don't want to do that anymore. Like that's it's just it's quite sad sometimes when you see it, because nobody wants to really help each other out. They just want to basically try and get as much as they can from any situation just to benefit them the most. Um, so yeah, it's quite sad that way.
It's hard though, because like, even when you're trying to help out in a community, for instance, it just gets very, very difficult, because the aspect of like, you want to get something for yourself, you want to do this, but sometimes some people can't just deal with themselves, like, it's the same reason, like, I don't have a dog for a simple reason. And this is going to be a really dumb example, but I don't have a dog for one simple reason, is because I do so much time doing podcasting and stuff of that sort, that it would be unfair to the dog if I was in a podcast recording for, let's say, 8 hours a day. I'm doing a recording, and this dog's just sitting outside the door crying and screaming. You know what I mean? It wouldn't be fair to him.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, by the way. My
That
my
computer was
computer
dying,
almost
wasn't it?
died.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really dying. Yeah, so
I,
I'm
s- I
trying
saw
to
I saw you pulling out the
get it
charger. I
charging.
was like, oh, this means it's a good conversation if he's willing to charge his computer to keep it going. Not just kidding.
Yeah. And there we go. I've saved it because like I was like halfway there, and I was thinking, well, halfway that should be long enough. And then I think it must be like using the mic and the video at the same time. It's just like depleting rapidly. I was
You're
like,
draining
okay, I
it.
better sort that out now.
But
Yeah, just
it,
draining that battery.
there is an importance, I think, in an aspect of, I think you still need to have that chance of survival. You still need to have that. I think struggle is important, because I think struggle creates a benefit effect when it comes to, if you can use it in the right way. If you sit there feeling miserable for yourself, you're not going to really go anywhere. But if you can use that struggle, you can kind of rise above it and become better than who you were before. You know what I mean? Like, even when it comes to like maybe a death in the family, or if it comes to hardships or bills or anything of that sort, you really got to kind of figure out what's your limit and how can you get past it. Because I think, obviously, they say the sky's the limit, but at the same time, like, you need a little bit of struggle, because when you don't have that struggle, you try and find it somewhere, and something you shouldn't be arguing with. Like, people shouldn't be fighting over Twitter stuff. People shouldn't be fighting over simple things of that sort, but it's all an era of misinformation and miscommunication. And I'm like, it's just, there's bigger things that we should be focusing on. Like, I always talk about PETA, for instance. Their main thing is like, they want to ban animal slurs. So you can't say beat a dead horse. You can't say that. You have to say feed a fed horse. And they listed these guidelines of words that they're banning and words they want you to say, so you're not offending animals. And I'm like, what the fuck are we doing? Like,
Yeah.
you're a animal protection agency, basically. Why don't you work on stopping all the industrial farming and working all these terrible places like
Mm.
slaughterhouses that are doing or unethical ways of slaughtering animals, instead of doing it the humane
Yeah.
way and the most peaceful way as possible, or all these force feeding animals to make them bigger and fatter and then killing them for food? It's like, you could fix all these issues, but you just want to work on, instead of saying two birds with one stone, it's fed two birds with a scone. It's like, are you fucking kidding me, man? Like, I just,
Yeah. Like, and offending animals, like the animals can't communicate with us anyway. So that doesn't make a difference. And it's like what you said, like they should what they should be doing is focusing on the industrial farming, all these things. Because I mean, what goes on, like every time I see a video like on my Facebook or something, it's horrible. It is horrible what you see, and you know, the only way that you could really get around it, I guess, is like you either become vegetarian or vegan, or you try and buy like local like chicken or whatever. So then that way it's not the industrial farms, and you're not like letting them profit from. It's basically animal cruelty, is it? And like, yeah, I hate seeing it. I hate seeing it all the time. But I mean, um, I suppose that's the only way that you could really get around it. Because I mean, like, you can't expect people to stop eating meat. That's just never going to happen.
Yeah.
So the only thing that you could do is like make sure that the animal has, you know, like a bit more of a fulfilling life rather than being crammed in a cage and just like force fed or like given loads of hormones and stuff so it grows bigger and then slaughtering it. Like that's just, it's just not a humane way of doing it at all. And you know,
Well,
people should try and do things differently in that sense.
look at the trials for Hercules when he had to jump through all those rings to be able to get what he needed to get, like to, once he finally
Mm.
completed all his trials, there was this sense of like, okay, well, you've got everything you want it to be now, but now what's the next step? And it made him depressed. It made him sad. He didn't have a goal that was worth
Mm.
fighting for. And I'm like, that's kind of with everybody right now is we're searching something to fight for. So whenever something comes across your way, you go 100% full into it. Not saying they're wrong, just saying like there's other things that are way more important we should be taking down. I think during the pandemic, everyone realized that the government had more power than we thought they did in our own lives. And I'm like, that's an issue.
Yeah.
You want to make sure you're free. But I feel like right now, at least for me, I don't feel as free as I did before the pandemic. I look at it like, wow, like everything shut down. Like they controlled my life and I thought I controlled my life. It's like, there you go. That's an issue that needs to be fixed. We have major issues that are going on in our own country that the whole damn world feels like they need to see. But every country has their issues. I've talked to people who are heavily invested in Canada politics, people that are invested in UK politics. Everyone's got issues going on. And I think it's now starting to bubble up to the surface because of the information that's getting out there. I'm like, yeah, use Twitter in a good way. Look at all the stuff that's trending. Don't care too much about the Dr. Seuss shit, but look at the stuff like, oh, okay, this is going on. This is with Brexit. This is with that. This is with this. I'm like, yes, understand what's going on in your community where you're from instead of worrying about what's happening 4 states or 4 countries away.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And I would like to get back to what you said earlier about like struggle and stuff, because I mean it is a big deal. I think what's happening now is like people, they don't struggle anymore, or they tend like they don't struggle like people used to anymore. If you go back in history where, you know, like you were one like drought season away from starving to death or something, you know, like we don't have that problem anymore. And I think like the main thing with struggle is like what you said, what the lessons that people learn from it and stuff, and as well as that, like it builds character. Um, it's a huge character builder to struggle, like because I mean, like,
You
um,
just gave me the best example. So back in the day, they used to pray and they used to pray for a rain, for something to end this horrible drought, for just so their crops can grow, so they can feed their families, so they don't starve to death. And now we pray for our fucking Wi-Fi to work just to be able to do a fucking podcast. Like it's
yeah,
so different. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing because I'm like, oh God.
I know, I know. In fact, there is a story that I learned about whilst I was doing my podcast. So it was the first, it was the founder of China's second dynasty, the Shang dynasty, and they were going through a drought at the time. And then what happened was the leader, he was supposed to be this like very benevolent leader. So he said, right, okay, what should we do to this like high priest? And then the high priest said, we need a human sacrifice. Like, they were getting that desperate. So they said, we need a human sacrifice. And then he said, I'll go and get a slave. To which the emperor said, no, I'm going to do it. So then he got dressed up in all the sacrificial stuff and everything. And then he went up to the altar to get sacrificed in front of everyone, made this big speech about how, you know, he's doing this for all of his people. He's hoping that his death will bring rain. And just before he killed himself, it started to rain. So then everyone thought that he had like divine right and stuff like that. So everyone loved this guy. So it's just like it goes to show, right? It's crazy, isn't it?
I wonder how long it's going to take before people try to sacrifice somebody to get their Wi-Fi back on.
Yeah, I know, right?
Like, I'm trying to watch the next episode of WandaVision and my connection keeps cutting out. All right, we got to make a sacrifice. You just go to your neighbor's house, like, hey, real quick, I need to sacrifice you in front of my modem to make sure I can get that good connection.
Yeah. Stop the buffering wheel going round, right?
So, what's the topic I would say that you find the most interesting through history?
um, the most interesting, probably like, I mean, I like Chinese history. This was something that I kind of found out when I moved to China. It was like Chinese history was it was fascinating. And what's fascinating about it is the fact that it just repeats itself a lot. So like you've got one dynasty, it gets corrupted and then it gets overthrown. And it just happens throughout the centuries. So I suppose like Chinese history definitely. And when I was at school, I really got into like the two world wars and stuff. To be fair, I like most areas of history. There's not going to be an area of history that I don't like because I like the Greeks and I like the Romans and stuff. Yeah, the most for now, I'm going to say Chinese history, like because that's what I'm reading into a lot more of just now.
Why specifically Chinese history, or that you're leaning more towards? Do you like the I guess the honorable stuff side of it, like the more of like because I talked to someone who studied Japanese heritage and culture when it happens to do with samurai swords. She runs a podcast called Stories of Sanawa. Um, but
Okay.
she was telling me like she's just fascinated with the culture behind it because yeah, it makes sense. Like people, they look at their Chinese or samurai swords, they look at them as like that's their grandparents, that's their soul inside of the sword that they carry on. It's like a piece of heritage, much like we might carry an urn or carry something from a loved one that has passed or something. Um, but it's crazy because you get to see a lot of people in America that really don't care about where they come from. And to me, that's just mind boggling because I'm like, why wouldn't you want to know your roots? Why wouldn't you want to know, like, if I was related to fucking the guy who invented peanut butter, like, I'd be 100% happy with that. I would love to know that I had a stock in Jif or something like that.
Yeah. So why Chinese history? I guess so. The first time I actually got into Chinese history, it's going to sound really dumb, but like I was 8 years old and there was a game. It was called Dynasty Warriors. I don't know if you ever played it.
No.
Well, so anyway, the game isn't even that good, but I got really into it because it told the stories behind the battles. So basically, what you do is you're this warrior, and you're basically a one-man army. Like you've got your army around you, but they're useless. So you've got to like cut down every enemy soldier that you find and all that stuff. And the thing with it was that it had all these stories behind the battles that you were fighting. So I was like, and then the thing is, like, I was just like, oh, it's a computer game, it's not real. And then there was one time I just got curious one day and I looked it up and it turned out it was real. So it was like all to do with like the Three Kingdoms period in China. And I was like, oh, that guy was actually real. So then like I started to look into it even more. And then before I knew it, I was like over in China. And then the weird thing is, like, the Chinese people, they all know their history. Like, a lot of people, like, if you say something about Chinese history, they're more than likely going to know about it because that is kind of like their heritage. So, that part of it kind of fascinated me. And I suppose when I started to read about it and stuff, it was more like you were just reading, and it's almost like a different way of thinking from the way that we did. So like there would be a battle, and somebody would come up with this brilliant strategy, and I was just thinking, I would never have thought of that. And like even like you're trying to compare it to the West in some way, and like I couldn't find any references. So I was just like, oh, okay, so that's something unique. So I suppose there's that. There's a lot of uniqueness to it as well, I guess.
As much as we look at them in the past as being like, oh, they're not as intelligent as we are today, I'm like, actually, we're thinking on the same lines that they were thinking. Like, I'm pretty sure during
Yeah.
the pandemic, everybody had an idea of like, hey, maybe we should burn the dead bodies so it doesn't, spread the infection. I'm like, they did that in the Black Plague, right? Like, they all were
Yeah.
burning the bodies. They just didn't know that, like, hey, you can't stand near it or you're going to get the infection through the smoke or something like that. Like, nobody understood germ theory, but it's like crazy to see how much like there has been a dramatic, like, I mean, even talking 20 years ago, 30 years ago, That's completely
Mm.
different. That's a lifetime
Yeah.
away. That's a lifetime ago. And people are like, "Well, it's not that long ago." I'm like, "No, it relatively is compared to where we're at now compared to 30 years ago. It's completely changed."
Mm.
But man,
Yeah.
500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, but we still think
Mm.
like borderline the same thing about some stuff. Like, when it comes to ideas of how to deal with situations, the first idea is like, "Oh, that's what they thought back then and they ran with it." But then we find a better and effective way using technology to make it even better, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, because it's happened a lot. Even well, it's not even in China, but like all over the world. So for example, when a new metal was discovered or like a new way of smelting the metal, then it spreads all over the world pretty quickly. Well, like not the Americas, but like throughout Eurasia and stuff. Like before, like so for example, bronze. So bronze was created in like the Middle East area, I believe, and then it spread everywhere. And then before you know it, the Greeks are using it, and so are the Chinese, and then next thing you know, iron comes along, and like what comes with it is almost like there's like a booming population and a booming way of different way of thinking and stuff, and it's like how humanity's progressed.
Yeah, I mean,
Mm.
progress. I don't know. I feel like we should go back to the sword era. I mean, you're gonna be less apt. Like with a gun, there's no connection to it. I'm like, if you're gonna,
Yeah,
some
that's for
people,
sure.
you hear about all these shootings nowadays. I'm like, it would be so different if we just had swords. Because like, imagine trying to like pull out a sword and then stab somebody. You have to literally hate that person so much to do that
Mm.
because it's just a whole different act. Like shooting somebody, there's no connection behind it. I'm not saying go shoot anybody. I'm just saying
Yeah,
with a
yeah,
sword, for instance, if we brought back like sword battles or sword duels, like at this time, you're going to fight this person in the square with a sword. And then by the time you got up to it, you're like, I don't really know if I want to do this. Like, I don't think I hate this person enough to stab them or do anything of that sort, which makes it crazy because if you look at the gladiators, like trying to rip somebody's head off and shit, it's like, oh my God, you're the only reason they were able to do that was because they were literally fighting. And if they didn't fight, they were going to die.
yeah, yeah. That is pretty crazy. But I mean, there is that, is it? Just because if you have to stab someone, it's like a lot of you have to put a lot of strength into it because they're going to defend themselves as well because you're trying to stab them. But I mean, it's really up close and personal. Whereas with guns, you don't have that anymore. So like, it's just as easy as pulling a trigger, and then before you know it, you've ended somebody's life. So yeah, it's that would be quite interesting if like you did bring that in. So like, right, okay, you've got a feud. The two of you are going to fight with swords, and let's just see who wins.
I'm
Because like
gonna
you
I'm
would
gonna I'm
probably
gonna have to
find the
write that
likelihood.
down and start a petition to get some people to sign bringing back the sword stuff.
Yeah, just bring back sword duels rather than gun ones. Yeah, and I
Like the
mean, with the gladiators and stuff, could you imagine like if you were captured or something and then you got thrown into the gladiator pit? Like, how terrifying must
I'd
that
be
have been?
dead first round. I wouldn't
Yeah.
make it past the
Oh
first
yeah.
round. I just I could definitely fight someone to death, but I don't think I would be doing very well. Okay with
Mm.
defending myself, but it's the whole like I know I would slip up or something would distract me, like a bird would be flying out in the background or some shit. I'm like, look at that fucking bird and get my head sliced off. But it was interesting to me because I was watching this movie called Boss Level, and they were talking about like this. The one of the assassins had a Chinese sword, and they were like, "Why do you use a Chinese sword? Why don't you just use a gun?" And he goes, "Because it's not the sword stab that hurts you; it's pulling it out that hurts the most." And it was like, "What?" And that was the whole thing of it was pulling out a Chinese sword. It's a very effective tool. It's actually more effective than a katana, um, mostly because they're thicker, but it was like, imagine that, like having the insane skill with a sword and then stabbing somebody. Like it fucking boggles my mind how someone could go through with an act like that. Like I had a person, it was like 2, 3 years ago. Guy got stabbed in my town 56 times. And I
Oh
was like, holy shit, how does someone hate somebody that much to stab them? And the cops were like, it was a gang thing. And I was like, how do you know it was a gang thing? And he goes, because you know how hard you know how much you have to hate somebody to stab them 56 times. And the only time someone is
yeah.
able to do something like that, at least as common as that was because you were fighting for something you didn't truly understand. Like people that fight, like, this is the hill I'll die on. Same thing with gangs, where they do gang shootings, they can kill a random innocent person to get initiated into a gang. It's a loyalty aspect of things. And that's how they chalked it up to a gang thing. I was like, that's fucking fascinating to me.
Yeah. And I mean, it happened. throughout history as well. Like you've always seen it. If it's a war on ideology or religion or something, it's always so much more violent than, you know, a war for a hill or something. You always find that people are committing like such, I would say, inhumane acts, but I mean, you're fighting in a battle. But I mean, like, it's like almost despicable, some of the stuff that happened. Like, for example, if you want to go to the Crusades and when the Crusaders took Jerusalem, I mean, it was a complete bloodbath. And it wasn't even as if they were like, you know, killing the infidels or the Muslims or anything. They killed everyone.
Yeah.
So it didn't matter if you were Jewish, Christian, woman, child, it didn't matter. They were pretty indiscriminate and just killed everyone. And even one of the Christian sources was saying like the men were knee deep in blood and still like hacking away at people and stuff. Like that's just insane. Like how could somebody do that? Like, and the thing is as well, like from what I read, the Crusaders were starving themselves. So I mean, like they must have had very little energy, but yet they felt this motivation to like try and kill people in such a way like that with just unrelenting force. But just it's crazy.
Well, think about 200 or 300 years into the future, where we look at them in the past and we go, oh my God, those people were horrible. But then 300 years from the future, people are going to look back on us and be like, they were horrible. Instead of fighting sword battles and stabbing
Yeah,
somebody, we're doing Twitter wars and we're having all these things over social media that causes depression and causes this psychological warfare where someone ends up hurting
yeah.
themselves. You know what I mean? It might be in
Mhm.
a different form, but it's kind of the same act. You're still hurting someone if
Yeah,
somebody takes their own life. Nobody knows the repercussions behind something they post on social media or something they say to someone on social media, not knowing what place they're in, you know. It's gonna
yeah,
it's we're in strange times, man. I don't know how else to explain it besides that. I have
yeah,
hopes for the future, but I also have my doubtful side too.
yeah. I mean, it was quite interesting because I remember when I was at university and I was reading like different political theorists and stuff, and Machiavelli came up, and you're reading it, and you're just like, "Ah, humans are kind of like that." You're just so like when you're looking into the future, you're just like, "Oh, I really like. I don't know if it's going to be a bright future or it's just going to be doom and gloom." And like when you mentioned the overpopulation thing, like surely there's going to be a breaking point where there's too many people on the planet. I mean, there's already studies saying that the Earth's in its fifth mass extinction phase, and it's because of human activity. So, like, how far could it go? Like, that's I suppose that's like the ultimate question, is it? Like, how far could this actually go?
But you know what? The future is still questionable. The future is
Mm,
still undetermined. But you know what is determined is
mm,
that people can find your podcast and they can listen to some history. They can look at stuff that's already happened and already been recorded.
mm. Yeah. That's probably why I like history. It's more like an escapism, is it?
So where can Dean, where can people find your podcast? Like what platforms is it on? Twitter, social media?
Yeah, so it's on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, as well as Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and it's on Buzzsprout as well. Like that's the host that I'm using. So you could find it pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Well, I'll make sure I link it all in the description, man. And thank you so much for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank podcast.